I'm delighted to be here as your co-host. If you don't know me, my name is Izzy. I'm part of the team here at Animas, and I'm delighted to be here for today's lecture, Human All Too Human, the Paradox of Change and the Art of Thriving as Who We Are, with Nick Bolton. So many of you will know Nick as the founder of the Animas Centre for Coaching and the International Centre for Coaching Supervision. His work has helped shape the field of transformative coaching, and his insights into growth and the human experience are always thought-provoking. I'm here to help facilitate the session and ensure a smooth and engaging lecture today. Before we kind of dive in, just a few house rules. Please do stay on mute throughout the session to minimise noise. If there is any problems at all, you'll be able to contact me directly using the chat function. Nick might indicate to me, and we'll take questions throughout, might stop and take a few questions. And the final thing today is that if you've got a AI note taker, please could you make sure to remove it, just to respect the kind of integrity of the session. So yeah, that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Nick now. Nick, if you want to begin.
Thank you very much, Izzy, and hello everyone. It's lovely to see you all here. Thank you so much for joining me at this time, 1 o'clock. Normally these lectures tend to be in the evening. And in fact, the last time I was meant to do this before I lost my voice, was it last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, that was going to be 2 o'clock in the morning for me because I was in Thailand at the time. And so which is why I put this back to 1 p.m. your time, because I'm currently in Cambodia. So this is now 8 o'clock, which is a much more human time for me, which is great. And let me just have a little look at who's here. I always like to kind of look, oh, Adam Tiger, what a great name. And Adam Tiger, what a fantastic, I wonder where that surname came from. Anyway, wonderful. It's so good to see people that I've known from the past, new people who I believe have just joined Animas, and people outside of Animas ecosystem and so on. So thank you so much for being here. First of all, apologies for the red face. I foolishly went walking in Phnom Penh today in 34 degrees and forgot to put a hat on. And when I got back, I was like, oh my God, my face is so red. So apologies for that. I guess it adds a humorous touch to what is quite I wouldn't say serious topic, but a relatively, kind of important topic, I believe. So where does this come from, this talk? Human, all too human. It went through a few iterations. I think the first time I came up with the title, it was going to be looking at transformative coaching as a response to the human condition. And that's something that really, really interests me. What is the human condition, and how does transformative coaching a response to that, which enables people to navigate the complexity of being human? And in a way, that title would have suited this, but the more it sort of lingered in my mind and sat with me, I thought, that's not quite what it is. There's something else that's happening for me, and I'm not quite sure. It feels like, for me, after all the lectures I've given throughout my sort of time with Animas, this is the one that's not quite become clear in my mind. There's something hovering there, and I think that in itself is quite indicative of what this is really looking to achieve, because it feels to me that we're going through some strange transitional period as a species where we're coming face to face with what it is to be human, because so much of what we thought was human is now being done by artificial intelligence. The creativity. I saw a funny article which was, I once thought that AI would take care of my cleaning and allow me to write books, but now it looks like it's going to write my books and I've got to do the cleaning. And I thought, that's so true. The thing we thought was so unique about us turns out isn't that unique, but it is confronting us with what is unique, I think, or at least it's emerging. And about a year ago, I did a talk called Absent but Implicit, and it was looking at the forces that we disavow in coaching, which I actually think offer an awful lot to us. Things like shame and judgment and impatience and stuff that the coach either feels or may feel or be perceived to feel by the client. And actually how once we recognize that that is a very human attribute and bring it into the space in a conscious, deliberate way, as opposed to a judgmental way, it gives us something important to work with as coaches and as clients. So there's something hovering in this whole space for me about what is the fallibility and the frailty of humanity, which becomes its own strength, especially for us as coaches. How do we take what we've perceived, generally speaking, as a problem or an issue to be avoided or to be bracketed away or to be, put aside for the hour that we're with our clients, how do we take that and start to recognize that it has great validity? I don't know if any of you have tried being coached by AI, but it hasn't. It seems to me, at least, and I'm sure it'll keep changing and changing and changing, but it seems to me it has an inability to recognize the ambivalence that human beings almost have on anything worth coaching on. Let's be honest. If you're going to make a cup of tea, you don't need to be coached on that. And there's, generally not speaking, not much ambivalence around it. You either want it or you don't. But when you're thinking about something significant like what to do with your intimate relationship, or what to do with your career, or how you feel about the purpose of your life, those things bring a lot of ambivalence and uncertainty. And I noticed that when I tried being coached by AI, it didn't sort of connect to that. Or even if it would, I would know it wasn't really connecting with it. It was aping the connection with it, because AI itself doesn't feel ambiguous. So then I started thinking, well, what about the client? Okay, so that's the coach. How do we bring the frailty of the human coach into the fore? But then I thought about the client. And when I first started training as a coach, or started coaching years and years ago in early 2000s, any of you who've been a coach for a long time will remember that the grow model was de rigueur. It was like literally pretty much all you had to do was do the grow model and jobs are good. And you move them from what do they want to where they are to what they could do to, are you going to do it? And if you're only a 9 out of 10, what would make you a 10 out of 10? Come on, let's get to that last little 1 point. They're fully committed. And then who are you going to be accountable to? Because we don't want you to fail. And it all seemed incredibly linear. And it didn't take me very long as a coach to think to myself, that isn't what I'm seeing in human beings. What I'm really seeing in human beings is this immense level of uncertainty about what people actually want. And even if they figure out what they want, an ambiguity and ambivalence about doing what's needed to get there. And I thought, well, we probably need to recognize that. And so I spent the next, 10 years or so focused on what it is to be human at a sort of an existential level. When I was still a young whippersnapper myself, I started coaching, I would have been about 30, early 30s. And so when I was going through that whole process, I was still what Jung would call in my individuation phase. I was still young and thrusting and building my coaching business and all this kind of stuff. And then in a way, I didn't connect with that ambivalence as something to be lived with. I connected with it as something to be figured out. How do we figure out your ambivalence? How do we overcome your ambiguity and all this kind of stuff? And as I reached the heady age of 55, am I 55? Yeah, 55. Blimey, 56 this year. As I realized that, as I've reached that age, I've realized that there is a lot of ambivalence and ambiguity and uncertainty and gray area that just doesn't seem to go away. That's what I think I've come to the conclusion is that we never come to this space of clarity. And actually, we're always living through the gray. We're always living through the cloud. But I've started to appreciate that. And so the reason why I want to do this talk, and I'll move to my presentation in a minute, but the reason why I want to do this talk is to encourage coaches who haven't yet got there to celebrate that space, to celebrate the uncertainty and the cloud of unknowing. As was it Julian of Norwich, I think? A medieval mystic. I'm sure it was Julian or Julius of Norwich. The cloud of unknowing. I kind of think that's part of being human. A little bit like Dante walking through the forest and, not having a clarity of where he was heading. So I started thinking about all of this stuff and, well, how do we treat that as something to celebrate rather than to overcome? And that's really what this talk is about. So I really, really appreciate you being here, and I hope that you get some value from it. I also recognize that you might be going like, blimey, Nick, it's taken you all that time to get there. I was there years ago. And if so, I apologize for, to repeat what you came to your own wisdom a long time ago. But I hope that it might offer you something. So let me quickly change to my presentation. Oh, I need to. So here we are, human or too human, the paradox of change and the art of thriving as we are. I want to start off with the essential question for this talk, but really more for me, which is, what if authentic change, and I put the word authentic in specifically because I think we can all change, but what if what does it mean to achieve authentic change? So what if authentic change isn't about following a plan to become different, but about adapting to who we truly are? That's the question I'm really kind of thinking about at the moment. And I want to say this, first of all, this is a reflection of my own experience of life. And it might not be the reflection of yours. There could be coaches on here who go, what's Nick talking about? Nonsense. I find if I get somebody focused on the solution, they head towards the solution, Bob's your uncle. Great. This is coming from a very phenomenological experience of my life as a 55-year-old guy who's been married 3 times, divorced 3 times, well, not divorced the 3rd time, but separated, had multiple businesses, some of which failed in my early years. Animas has been going for a long, long, long time, but we have these ups and downs. And so this is coming from that. It's also coming from what I would call an emergent sense of something, which is intangible, which is why I haven't quite landed this talk in my head yet, really. Maybe I'll land it in about a week's time and be like, that's what I wanted to say. What do they call that? Esprit d'escalier. Kind of like a lecture style of esprit d'escalier. Like, I should have said that for the last hour. But it's something emerging for me and I can't quite pin it down, but it's there. And maybe that's a reflection of the whole thing. I would ask you to bear with me because I'm going to start sort of abstract and end up sort of practical, I hope, somewhere along the line. And, I don't think there's anything new here, really, but I think it is a reminder for us coaches to slow down. If you've had any form of, what I call transformative coach training or facilitation, but it doesn't have to be called transformative. Anything that works with the inner model of the world is fundamentally transformative. If you had that, there's a very good chance you'll be doing at least some of what I'm about to talk about. So let's talk about, first of all, the paradox of change, which is, the title of this lecture, but it was something said by, something talked about, the paradoxical theory of change by Dr. Arnold Beiser in 1970. He was a Gestalt psychotherapist. I think he was a psychoanalyst, actually, but anyway. Yeah, I think he was a psychoanalyst who became a Gestalt therapist. But he talked about the paradoxical theory of change, which is often known now as the paradox of change. Well, fundamentally, it says this: change happens best when we become what we are, not what we are not. Change happens best when we become what we are, not what we are not. In other words, when we try to change ourselves into something different, the change is less effective than truly inhabiting who we already are. And you might say, well, how is that change then? If we're embracing who we are, how is that change? Surely we're reinforcing ourselves rather than changing something. And that bothered me for a long time, I must admit, because one of the questions is, well, what are we? As an existential thinker, which is predominantly what I am, I don't mean I've sort of adopted wholesale existential philosophy, but I can loosely say that what I think about the world maps itself pretty well to existential thinkers. And one of the concepts there is that there is no essence to a person. Sartre famously said, existence precedes essence. In other words, how you live your life shapes who you are, rather than how you are shapes how you live your life. And for a long time, I really felt that. And I think a lot of schools of thought also backed it up. NLP is a classic example that you can become anything you want to be, often by flicking a switch, by creating a simple anchor, or by modeling somebody else, or whatever. It's all about existence precedes essence. There is no essence. There is no identity. There is no core. Theoretically, based on that. Another thing that I'm going to come back to my little challenge, my implicit challenge I just mentioned, but it's how does becoming what we are then enable change to happen? Or does it? Those are 2 questions that kind of really hovered for me, and I struggled to really wrap my head around this. I've written a few articles on the paradoxical theory of change, posted on the Animas blog, and I've explained them, in a clear way, theoretically, but I never really, if I'm honest, I never really got what it meant, the paradoxical theory of change. I often had this question mark. Okay, well, that's what it means. But how are we changing if we're staying the same? How are we changing if we're accepting ourselves? And, some of you on this call might be laughing to yourselves going, what a moron, it took him so long. But, for me, I was like, I guess I'm that very solution-oriented person in some ways. Although I think transformatively in terms of how we navigate the world, I act in a very solutions-oriented way. I act in a way that's about changing the world around me rather than changing my inner world necessarily. In fact, I often feel my inner world changes as a result of my external behaviors. And so I kind of struggle to get my head around, really, do I take this on board? Until in my very recent years, I considered my own life through the lens of this paradoxical theory of change, or rather I considered my life and then realized, it's that blinking paradoxical theory of change thing, isn't it? Because what I realized was that there's this kind of micro versus macro thing that's going on, at least for me. I've said for many years, Ruth, who's on this call, my managing director of Animas, Ruth, I've said to her many times, like, it amazes me how long people get stuck with the same problem. How did you live with that problem for so long? Like, if there's something in your life that you don't like, change it. That was my approach to life. It was my approach to coaching in lots of ways. Yeah, we can do all the inside work we want to, but if you're not doing something pragmatic on the outside to change things, nothing much is going to change. Was my initial thinking for 20 years. But I realize now that in a way that's the micro stuff. If you want to change your health, you can do things that change your health, and you can start that today. If you want to do things to change your wealth, you can do things to do that, to change that today. If you want to change your relationship, you can do things today. That's micro stuff, I realized. And that's really been, I don't understand why people get stuck with the micro problems of life. But when I think about the macro, I realize, wow, that doesn't seem to change much, or at least it doesn't for me. I'm kind of curious whether, as you listen to what I'm about to say, you feel the same or whether you feel very different. But I look back at myself and I think, wow, Nick, you haven't really changed a lot. When I think of myself as a 18-year-old kid, getting married getting engaged at 17, getting married at 21, leaving my wife at 28, I still recognize myself in a lot of those behaviors. I recognize my impulsiveness. I recognize my people-pleasing qualities that meant I carried through with that marriage, even though I wasn't in love with my girlfriend, even before we got married. I recognize my decisiveness once I decide that something does need to change, which is why once I decided to leave, I left. These things don't change. And I'm like, are these hardwired? Or are they not hardwired, but I just haven't done enough work? Do I need to do 30 years of psychoanalysis to get to the point where they do change? But do I want to? Am I okay with who I am? Do I rather like who I am? I think I do. Despite all the flaws, despite my irritations to the people around me, my constant mind changing, my ability to make a decision and be so firm about it, and then realize I'm completely wrong and change my mind to the absolute polar opposite just a week later, despite the fact that I have these, impulsive behaviors, such as the fact that the reason why my lecture last time, the one I had to cancel, was at 2 a.m. was because I was meant to be in Dubai, and 10 p.m. seemed okay. But I got back to Dubai, and after a week, I was like, I don't want to be here. I was meant to be there for a month working. I was like, I don't really want to be here. Let me go back to Thailand for a bit. That kind of repeating impulsiveness is part of who I am. My lack of clarity, which might sound strange to some people who know me, because I can be very clear on some things, but actually I'm very unclear on what my life is. Like, I can't figure out what on earth I'm here for. I can't figure out what my purpose on this planet is, if there even is one. I can't figure out whether I love my business or can't stand my business. I can't figure out whether I love traveling or can't stand traveling. No, that's not true. I do like traveling. But I have these moments of deep loneliness when I'm traveling. I'm like, why have I done this to myself? But these are all, it seems to me, all enduring characteristics of who I am. And I don't know if I can change them or if I want to change them, because they've served me through my life. I feel like a happy person. Frustrated, bored, lonely. But I wouldn't change it. I know that. I like my life, despite those downsides of traveling alone all the time. Despite running a business where sometimes I was like, why am I doing this? I still wouldn't change any of it because I like my life. And I think I like my life because I'm living to my characteristics. So I start thinking, how do we help clients live with who they are? if it's something where I'm always very conscious when I say these things that some of you on the call might be going, that's what I do. And if you do, fantastic. I don't mean in any way through a talk like this to suggest that I've come to this epiphanic moment that I've got to deliver to the world and you all be in awe as I walk down Mount Sinai with two brand new tablets of stone with these new coaching rules. No, not at all. This is just my realization. And if it's useful for anyone listening, that's great. And if it's not, that's also great. So let me move now to where that led me, because I started thinking, and again, this ties in with the whole AI thing for me. Like the AI thing for me is so fascinating because I absolutely adore AI. I think it's absolutely incredible. And I love what it's doing for me in the short term. Where it's going to take us as a civilization, goodness knows. But in the short term, it's amazing. But it's also really confronting me with what it is to be human. So I started thinking, well, what is it to be human? Which, let's be honest, they tend to be our client group, don't they? Even if you haven't got a niche, you will find that your client group is humans. That's a pretty broad niche, but that's what we tend to be working with. And so I thought, well, really, 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 when it comes down to it, what is it to be human? And there are certain things that you could say, the existentialists say we're embodied. Well, guess what? So's a dog. So's a flea. So's a virus embodied. So that doesn't make us uniquely, it doesn't make us unique to have a body. But there are certain things that do make us unique. And I think they are what show up for both good and bad in the coaching space. Things like, so by the way, I'm going to say this. I've got no idea what a dog is thinking. Maybe the dog is it's a bit like I'm rereading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at the moment. And if any of you know it, the most intelligent creatures on Earth turned out to be interdimensional beings who disguised themselves as mice. The second most intelligent were dolphins, and the third was humans. Now, it could be that's the case. I've got no idea. But based on what we think we know, self-awareness seems to be pretty much unique to humans. And the ability to reflect proactively on ourselves, which is what I've been doing that's led to this talk. It's like, what is going on for me and why am I doing it like that way? And do I want to change it or not change it? That's pretty unique. Then we have the complexity of language and all the joys that brings us in terms of misunderstandings and miscommunications and, missing information. I remember studying NLP and the classic delete, generalize and distort of the meta model. Such a fantastically simple model and so powerful, but language is so complex and yet it's so weak as well. I remember I was going out with a girlfriend years ago and we were discussing splitting up, I think. And I remember saying something and realizing that what I said didn't capture remotely what I was feeling inside. It was like, we have this thing called language, but it's so inherently weak and yet at the same time powerful. So we're dealing with that all the way through coaching. And then, of course, humans have imagination and creativity. They can imagine another future. They can imagine, what it is to be a different person or have a different life. And they can create that in their mind. They can also create it in reality. I often think of myself describe myself as a business artist, not an entrepreneur. I think entrepreneurs are people that seek opportunities, which is great. I've never really felt that way. I've felt like trying to create a masterpiece in some way. And it's an ongoing work, just like any artwork is. But I think the human spirit is a very creative one. And then, of course, we have moral reasoning. There's no black and white in this world. I remember when I was studying at Metanoia, one of the lecturers at the time, we were talking about morality and good and bad and so on. He said, of course, we're not talking about absolute relativism here. And I said, why not? Like, let's be honest. That's not to say that we can't choose something, but why can't we possibly accept absolute relative morality? It's possible. It's possible that we can have that. In which case, how do we navigate that? We can't assume our clients think and feel the same ways we do. And then there's temporal awareness, not just, and in fact, my next lecture is going to be exactly on this, which is our relationship to time, but also within temporality is our awareness of our mortality. We have some recognition that is going to come to an end one day. We hope it's going to be a while away in most cases, but it could be tomorrow. I was talking to somebody the other day and they mentioned that the husband had died in a motorbike accident 2 years, just after 1 year after they had a child together. Just thought, and I said to her, wow, like, you just don't know, do you? You get up that day thinking you're going to have a normal day. Boom. So we have this kind of, despite our denial of it, the Irvin Yalom's concept of the denial of death, despite that, we also know at some visceral level that time is passing and our time here is passing. Then we have cultural complexity, not just culture in terms of nationhood or continentalhood or racehood or any of that stuff, but just the cultures we construct, the cultures we construct historically and sociologically and so on. And then, of course, ultimately, and I think this is probably true for everyone at some level, there's the pursuit of meaning and purpose. Not everyone thinks of it in those terms, but I think if anyone felt their life was meaningless, utterly meaningless, and what they were doing was utterly pointless, whether it was bringing up a child or doing a job or having friendships or whatever it might be, if it was utterly meaningless, I think it would be hard to survive that. So at some level, there's this pursuit of meaning and purpose. And then finally, what makes us utterly human is our emotional complexity, our ability to recognize those emotions. So that got me thinking, okay, so what's the reality of human behavior? Given all that, given that kind of melange of complexity and richness and, non-linearity, let's say, what's the reality? Well, this is probably a self-portrait more than anything, but I suspect that at least one or two of these will ring true for some of you. And if not, you guys are amazing. But the first one is indecisiveness and changing one's mind. I used to think I was decisive. By the way, I'm Libran. I was born in October. I don't really believe in horoscopes, astrology. I believe in horoscopes. They exist in newspapers, don't they? But I'm not sure I believe in astrology at all. But I have to say, the description of a Libran is pretty blinking accurate when I realize, when I think about it, because I think I've made up my mind, but then I change it almost, whenever I want to, basically. And I can be so convinced that I've made my mind up, which is why I used to think I was decisive until I was like, oh my God, I constantly change my mind. So clients do the same, I think. Procrastination and avoidance. We often wonder, why is this client, they say they want this, but why are they procrastinating? Uncertainty and ambivalence. Emotional inconsistency. That's definitely a self-portrait for me. Like my poor wife, my poor third wife. I said to her before I left, we had a wonderful amicable breakup, and we remained great friends, because she knew that the life I was living wasn't the right one for me, and the way I knew that was because my emotions were like a pendulum. I was swinging from being like, "Wow, how did I create this amazing life with this beautiful woman who I'm so happy with?" And then the next week I'd be like, "I can't do this anymore. Wow, everything she does annoys me." And then the next week I'd be like, "Oh my God, why was I thinking that? She's the most amazing person." This emotional inconsistency was crazy for me. It felt like, why is this happening? A lack of commitment to what you think you're committed to. And Ruth on this call will know that from me. Like 1 minute I seem to be so committed to something, and I'm like, you know what? I'm not too bothered. What changed? Inner conflict between desire and action. We think we want something, but then there's lack of action. Self-sabotage and repeating patterns. Resistance to letting go of the familiar. I actually invented a phrase for this recently because I've been traveling now since January 2024, so just over a year and 2 months. No, I've actually lost this thing now, but for a while I had what I called flyer's remorse, which is my witty pun on buyer's remorse, which was I would get somewhere. Let's say I go to Dubai and I'm there for 2 weeks, and then I'm going to fly off to Thailand or fly off to Nepal or wherever I'm going to go. And the night before I'm due to fly, I'm like, oh, why am I doing this? It's nice here. I like this Airbnb. I like Dubai. I like the shops. I like the food. Why am I doing this? And I'd be going to I go to the airport kind of stressed. Did I forget my passport? Oh my God, why am I going to Nepal? I don't need to go to Nepal. Dubai is much nicer. The minute I got on the plane, woof, it would all go. And I'd arrive in Kathmandu or arrive in Bangkok or wherever it was. And I feel like, great, new adventure. But that moment of letting go of what felt so familiar, and that even in a 2-week period of time, it's like, what? How did it get so familiar within 2 weeks? These things, they sort of start to blow my mind about certainly how I live and what that means to the coaching space. And then reliance on external validation, something I didn't think mattered too much to me, but I started to realize I did, especially as I started to produce more and more content. Some of you I know have seen my PDF that I recently did on the 12 principles of transformative coaching. I posted it on LinkedIn as a kind of just a bit of a throwaway. I'm not gonna make a big deal of this yet. But here it is, guys. If you want to read it, here it is. I've had such wonderful feedback, but part of that is making me want to shrink away because I'm like, this external validation is making me feel like I've got to live up to it. like, thank you guys, thank you everyone, but I don't want to live up to this. I want to be small. It's a really funny feeling for me because I never think of myself like that. But all of this stuff is making me realize that, wow, we're so much more complex than we realize we are. And of course, ultimately surrounding all of this is existential doubt, or at least for me, as somebody that's got no faith, no identifiable faith, let's say. I've always got this kind of existential doubt about what on earth is it all for? And I remember, for a long time, kind of looking forward to non-existence, and reading Dostoevsky's The Devils, and Kirillov saying, when a man overcomes fear of death, he becomes a god. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's so true. If you don't fear death, then anything else is possible, because death is your escape route. It's kind of like a Stoic philosophy, really, in the sense of death is the final exit. But in reality, that's not how you experience life. Like, you want it to keep going on, so you end up with this kind of weird, I end up with this kind of weird feeling of like, at one level, like, Freud, I forgot what Freud called it, but Freud talked about this idea of the drive towards non-existence. He talked about the idea that when we come into the world, we're stimulated for the first time, a bit like Hegel's concept of, the other. The self only becomes aware of itself through the other. And Freud said something similar. I've forgotten exactly, but it was essentially like we become aware through stimulus from the outside, but we're always heading towards a desire for non-stimulation. In other words, non-existence. And of course, that's a very Buddhist concept too. So all of this kind of stuff, it floats around and floats around and floats around, and it finds its way into religion and philosophy and all this stuff. But ultimately, as I often say, for me, transformative coaching is kind of lived philosophy. We're helping people navigate life without calling it philosophy. We're really dealing with philosophical questions most of the time. So before I go into what I think are ways that we can coach, and why self-acceptance is an important part of what we not aim to achieve, but that we facilitate a discussion around at the very least, I want to talk about what I think of as some of the unconscious shoulds of coaching. Coaching is predicated on this idea of unknowing. And, you'll be aware, of course, that that's for some of you will be aware, that's one of the 12 principles. In fact, unknowing is the base of all of it. As a coach, we inhabit a space of unknowing. And yet, I do feel there are certain unconscious shoulds. That's a hard word to say. Unconscious shoulds. Try saying it, it's quite tricky. That sort of inhabit the coaching space and influence the nature of the questions we ask without our even knowing it necessarily. And I want to share what I see as some of those, because I think before we can move towards this idea of the paradox of change and self-acceptance, or becoming what we are, I wouldn't even call it self-acceptance, it's more than that. It's becoming what we are, which is different from self-acceptance, I think. But I want to talk about these shoulds because I think they do impact what we do in coaching sometimes. And they're almost like cliches, but they sort of hover in coaching. One of them is, to be your best self. Certainly as a coach, when I first trained, one of the sort of questions was like, how can you be the best version of yourself? Or what does that look like times by 10? Or it was this kind of idea of exponentiality and like explosiveness of being. Don't just be okay being yourself. Be more than yourself. Be the absolute optimal version of yourself. And of course, we've seen this, on YouTube, and I'm sure you've seen multiple things on YouTube around this kind of thing, whether it's a fitness thing or a wealth thing or a whatever it might be thing. It's like, be your best self. And I do feel to some degree that is part of the coaching ethos, even if we perhaps don't recognize it is, and it can influence some of the questions we ask. And another one is to always be positive and grateful. What are you grateful for today? Nothing very much other than repeating that I'm grateful I'm alive. Sometimes these things they can get in the way because they feel like a judgment. It's like, if I'm asking you what you're grateful for, I'm not accepting that today you're not really grateful for much. I'm not accepting that. I'm trying to turn you around. I'm trying to change you. I'm trying to make you feel grateful for something, even though what you're really saying to me is, I don't feel grateful today. So there's something in coaching where I apologize for generalizations here, Some of you absolutely might not do any of these, and some of you might, and it's a good time to reflect as you go through this. So apologies for the use of the word we, but the coaching profession has this kind of focus on being positive and being grateful. And then following your passion. If you follow your passion, you're going to be happier, more successful. Not always the case. And in fact, of course, the word itself, passion, comes from the word suffering. So what it's really saying is follow your suffering, which is probably not bad advice based on what I'm talking about in terms of inhabiting who you really are. But really, when we talk about follow your passion, it's kind of like what draws you, and then how do you immediately go for that? But it might not necessarily be the right thing. And of course, there's the classic Walt Disney, if you can dream it, you can do it. And we talked about this in the last one on personal agency versus systemic forces. We have to recognize, as Heidegger said, that we're thrown into a given context, thrown into a given historical context with all the limitations that brings. Like, I'm sorry, you ain't going to wake up tomorrow as a Roman emperor. No matter how much you wish you would, it's not going to happen. You were born in the 20th century, or if you're very young and on this call, you were born in the 21st century. You are part of a historical moment. And so whilst that's a beautiful sounding phrase, the reality is there are a lot of systems around us and a lot of historical context. In fact, I wrote a post today on Ian Hacking's concept of historical ontology, which is that our ways of being are often defined by and to some degree limited by the historical period we're in. Ontology being the study of being, and obviously, historical ways of being. Some fascinating studies on how scientific diagnoses can change people's behavior because they start to live up to those very things. Another one is, this is a good one, isn't it? I hear this a lot. Maybe you do. Eliminate toxic people, even family and friends. A number of times I've heard people say, doesn't matter who they are. If they're toxic, eliminate them. Like, what kind of world are we trying to build if that's who is toxic in the first place? What do we mean by toxic? What does a toxic person represent, and what makes them toxic? Is it your toxicity that's being reflected? Is it theirs? Is it your interpretation of toxicity? Like, what is it really? And how might we change the way we think about that so that we can actually include people in our lives rather than exclude them? I'm not saying that we should just go like, well, you're all welcome, but at least let's not assume that this is a universal truth. And then, of course, another one is you're responsible for your happiness. You are, but you're also not. Like, you can't just turn a switch and be happy. Happiness is a symptom of I'm not sure how you would describe happiness, but for me, happiness is more of a symptom than something you work towards. You work towards a whole lot of stuff that perhaps produces happiness, but it's not something you can aim at in itself. It's a sort of a reflection, if you like. And that's not something you can just be responsible for because you're part of systems that impact that. Or you've got conditions that might impact that. And you have full control of your life. Interesting. Well, it's a good concept, and it's what I tackled in the last lecture I gave. But it's one of these things where if we assume that to be true, how might we be imposing non-reality on our clients? So those are just some unconscious shoulds. By the way, I'm not sure if any of you are taking notes, but we will send these slides out afterwards. We'll make sure they get sent out to you as a PDF. Okie dokie. Where have we got to? Let's think about moving towards self-acceptance and what that means. Bear with me a sec. I'm just going to have a quick drink of water. Hold on one sec. Okay, towards self-acceptance. I think the first thing, when I start thinking about myself, this is a very selfish talk in some ways, a very selfish lecture. Well, not so much selfish, but kind of self-referential, let's say. Because these are some of the things I started to do as I started to really think, wow, Nick, why do you keep doing the same thing? What does it matter? So the first thing I started doing is really thinking about what is the meaning of why I do what I do, rather than how do I change it, rather than judging it, rather than thinking it was something to be shifted. I started really thinking, what's the message? It's a little bit like an existential philosophy. They say that emotions are messengers. And so true. Emotions aren't inherently true or false or real or fake, but they have a message. And I think it's the same with ways of being. It's like, why did I go back to Dubai and immediately want to leave? It's not a problem. So if it's not a problem, what is it? And I started to realize that one of my strengths, if you like, is tuning into what does feel right for me in a given moment. I went to Dubai, and in that week I was like, I don't belong here right now. As in that week, it was like, no, I've stopped my little travels too soon at the moment. Let me go back. I tuned into what felt real for me, rather than thinking to myself and judging myself. Nick, you're always changing your mind. You've got to buck your ideas up. Just stick with it. What classic kind of stick with it idea that's often in coaching. How do you become consistent and stick with it? Robert Cialdini wrote a fantastic book called Influence, the Art of Persuasion. One of the principles that Cialdini talks about is the idea of what he calls commitment and consistency. And a friend of mine, actually Yannick, I'm not sure if Yannick's on this call today, but he said to me, one of the things he really liked about me was how I changed my mind so easily without worrying about whether people think I'm flaky or not. Now, maybe I'm flaky, I really don't know. And what does flaky mean in the first place? But I think the strength behind that is simply recognizing what feels right in that moment, not whether it is right, but what feels right in that moment, and not being afraid to be judged by others for that perceived flakiness. Now, that's how I sought meaning in it. It doesn't mean it's true. Somebody could look at it and go like, that's a great excuse, Nick. Well done for living with your foible. Maybe, I don't know. But for me, I started to think, no, that feels right. I'm doing what feels right in the moment, and it may not be right or wrong for the future, but it's right for me. Now, if I was in a coaching session and a coach helped me surface that would be extremely helpful, versus saying, how could you stick with your choices? How could you remain consistent and committed, as Cialdini talks about? Because the point about Cialdini, he was talking about how marketing manipulates people. And one of the ways marketing manipulates people is they seek out where somebody has shown commitment and they make them consistent towards that. Well, if you're willing to not be consistent and you're willing to be true to yourself in any given moment, it's harder to manipulate you. So I started to kind of think of myself in those terms. And by the way, this isn't about saying that they're right or wrong, but just rather, if I accept myself as I am, if I stop trying to change myself or think there's something wrong with it, how do I recognize it as a strength I can lean into and make more of? Recognizing also the impact that has on other people, and therefore how I cushion them from that impact, or how we understand me better so they know that impact is coming. Like, one of the things I love at work with Ruth is she gets me. And because she gets me, I can do things that somebody else might go like, oh, working with this guy is a nightmare. She doesn't, I don't think she feels that way, because she gets me. So she's almost prepared. She's almost prepared for my strange behaviors. So the next one is, deepening self-knowledge for better decisions. Once you start to know yourself, you can start to make decisions about the future. How I react in the moment, the first bullet point there, is how I'm seeking meaning in my existing way of being now. How I use my self-knowledge for better decision-making means that I don't necessarily need to make the same mistakes again and again. After I separated from my wife, third wife, I wrote a list of life lessons for myself, and one of them was, don't get married again. Now, that might sound glib, but it's a reflection of my realization that there is no one person that I could ever live with I don't believe that I would be happy with for the rest of my life. It's not who I am. It's not. And the number of people that say, "Oh, you just haven't met the right person yet," and I'm like, no. If that's what it is, then it puts the blame on the other person, and I really, really, really don't believe the blame is on the other person. I know is the blame on me. It's just who I am. And once you start to realize who you are, you go like, okay, that's a good decision. Don't get married again, in my case. And many other decisions start to come from that, because you start to realize who you are, and you can decide how to live your life more authentically to who you are, rather than changing who you are to fit what you think you should do. I.e., how do I make sure if I get married a fourth time, no, I'm not going to go through 5 years of relationship therapy to figure out, no, because I actually don't feel I need that. So that's self-knowledge for me. By the way, as listeners, I'm sure there's some of you there kind of thinking you've understood it in a different way about me, and you might absolutely be right. I don't say any of this with certainty. It's just where I'm coming to. I want to keep repeating that. So the next one is really learning to value the way we are and how they serve us. In other words, starting to actually appreciate it for what it, so it's not just the seeking meaning, it's appreciating. It's actually being proud of is the wrong word, but being okay with it. Think about transactional analysis, the idea of I'm okay, you're okay. You might be very different in your relationship to relationships, or very different in your relationship to whatever. But I'm okay, you're okay. Once we start to be okay with who we are versus who we think we should be, what Byrne would have called unconditional strokes, let's say, unconditional self-stroke versus a conditional self-stroke. In other words, I'm not stroking myself based on the idea of what I did right or did wrong, or what I achieved or didn't achieve. I'm giving myself a positive stroke based on I'm okay as I am. Once you learn to value it, you can be okay with who you are. And then shaping a life that suits who we are. The amount of frustration I've had in my life for somebody that's achieved a decent amount is ridiculous. And I said recently to somebody that I realized it was because the shape of my life was wrong. The number of times I've run away from Animas, my business, because I haven't fully done what I wanted to do with it, but I also haven't had the level of commitment to get where I want to get with it. And because of that, I move away from it. And then I move back towards it, and I move away from it, and I move back towards it. And I started to think, like, what's that about? And I realized it was because I wasn't doing it in the way I really wanted. And equally, I was living life as a middle-class man in London, in an apartment in Canary Wharf, same place every day, same walk every day, same shops every day, even though I've got no kids, even though I don't want kids. I was like, why am I living life in a way that I don't need to? And that's why I decided to go traveling the world, at least for this phase of my life. And the way I described it to somebody recently is the shape of my life, the water's the same, but the shape of the container is different. And I realized the water was always right. Creativity as an entrepreneur was right. I felt it, but it also became frustrating at times, very frustrating at times, because I was living it in the wrong way. So I think there's something about making sure that the way you shape your life suits who you are versus shaping who you are to suit what you think life should be like. By the way, it's really tough doing online lectures sometimes because I cannot see any of you. I can only see my slides, and I've got no idea if you're yawning, falling off your seat, like just dropping out like this. I've got no idea what's going on, but I hope you're enjoying this, or at least finding some value in it. Another one is allowing contradictions to coexist. I talked to my friend Nathan recently about this because he's very similar to me. He notices that he has one belief about something here and another belief that's completely contradictory to that over there. And they inhabit the same space. In other words, they're both about business, or they're both about relationships, or they're both about health, or they're both about meaning, or they're both... It's like, how do these two go together? And then you sort of realize that it's okay to move between them. And one day you believe this, and one day you believe that, and one day you believe this, and one day you believe that, and it's okay. For me, I feel like there are a lot of contradictions in my life, but I feel okay about them. I don't judge myself on them coexisting. So I wonder to what extent we try to iron out our clients' contradictions. Well, that doesn't make sense. So let's figure out what's real here. I know that as a young coach, when I was a young whippersnapper coach, that's how I felt. I used to think of coaching like a logic tree. If this, then that. If this, then, and you kind of go until you got to the logical end point. When I first started coaching, that's how I felt about it. And what I realize now is coaching is an incredibly emergent experience where you never quite know where that client's going to land because they're always changing in themselves. Even their existing beliefs are settling at different times in different places. The same client in the same day can believe two different things that don't make sense to what they're being coached on. And if we don't accept that, we're going to really, really struggle with the true nature of humanity, in my opinion. And then trusting the ebb and flow of motivation. I've often been described as being like a tide coming in and out of my business. And some people see that positively, some people less so. One minute I'm like, I'm done. I'm running off. And I went to live on a canal boat for 3 years. And then I'm done. I'm running off. And then sometimes I'll be like, I'm coming back. I'm going to solve everything. And I'm like this kind of tsunami that washes in. One person said that it was great because it means that the flotsam and jetsam gets cleaned away. And when this tide goes out, it leaves a whole fresh lot of flotsam and jetsam. But I think now that once you start to recognize that motivation ebbs and flows and it's not consistent, or at least doesn't have to be, then we can accept that that's the reality of being human. And then letting go of the pressure to fix oneself. If we just accept ourselves as we are, that need to fix and figure out, and what do I need to change about myself, and how am I going to kind of jiggle my brain around to change myself? It just goes. And it's such a liberating experience to start to live into who you are versus fix who you think you should be, or fix what you are to be what you should be. And then finally, I think finally, two more. Recognizing wisdom in resistance. So if you're resisting something in your life, start to really recognize the wisdom in that resistance, rather than that it's, so if you think about procrastination, if I'm procrastinating, why? Is it, I mean, I was thinking about, was it Plato? I think it was Plato, through the mouthpiece of Socrates, when he was talking about, I think maybe it was Aristotle, maybe it's Nicomachean Ethics, doesn't really matter. But he talked about this idea that if you understand what virtue is, you will naturally be virtuous, because to be virtuous is to be happy. It makes sense. And yet it's not true if you really, really think about it. And it's a little bit like that, just because you think you want something doesn't mean you actually will start to live it out. So that resistance might point to something worth looking at. And then finally, experiencing change within acceptance. In other words, the change doesn't have to be an external change, although it can be. The change can be simply the act of acceptance. Like, whew, I suddenly feel a lot lighter because of this kind of journey I've been through. Okay, I'm going to kind of get slightly, I said to you at the very start that we're going to start abstract and then go practical. I just want to pause again, Izzy. I'm not going to close my slides. If there's anything coming in you want to share, now is the time, and I'm going to move into more like the coaching side.
There are a couple reflections that I can share.
Yes, yeah.
Maureen says, love your reflections, Nick. Accepting the complexity of being human. Once we accept being in the unknown state, we thrive. We give up those model verbs, should have, would have, etc.
Maureen, that might be your experience, and if so, wonderful. I find I haven't given up on the should haves. It's like, one of the things I accept about myself is I do have a should have mentality, and I'm okay with that now. Whereas before I felt like having shoulds and musts was necessarily something I should give up, because I'm a coach now. How can I believe in shoulds? In fact, I should have added that to the list of shoulds, shouldn't I? You should have no shoulds. Now I recognize I have them, and I'm okay with that. So in a way, even the things like that can be part of something we accept. That doesn't mean that we suddenly have to all accept shoulds. For you, Maureen, you might feel like, no, I really did give them up, and that's wonderful, fantastic. I really mean that, heartfelt. But for me, I realized now I'm good with my shoulds. That's also part of acceptance. I hope that sort of makes sense. And in case, this is the whole point, isn't it? It's becoming who we are, as opposed to who we should be. And it just happens to be that the person I am quite enjoys having a few shoulds in my life. It gives me direction. Maybe because I don't have anything else meta above me. So my shoulds are my metas. Maybe, I don't know. Alrighty, so let's talk about the coaching side of it. I hope you haven't been too bored listening to all this before I've got to the practicality stuff. But I don't really think this is about being too practical. It's more of a change of how we think about coaching, in my opinion. But let's talk about embracing the mess of humanity, and using coaching as a space for the human, as opposed to for the doer, for the achiever, for the linear. Let's think about coaching as a space for the human. I'm just going to put these all up first, and then, there we go. And I'll go through them briefly. The first thing is non-judgment as foundational. Look, we all get taught as coaches about being non-judgmental. And I believe almost certainly that's something we take on board very well. But I think when it comes to this idea of being with somebody else that accept themselves, non-judgment becomes even more vital. That doesn't mean we can't share what we see, but we do it in a way that's unknowing, phenomenological, collaborative, all these things that I talk about as the 12 principles. We do it in a way that isn't judgment. Judgment is to assume right and wrong. Actually, I'm going to whiz these off, sorry. Makes it too confusing. Judgment is about right and wrong, whereas noticing is different. So the first thing I think we really need to do with this kind of embracing that is really be non-judgmental. I remember years ago, I've told this story a few times, but when I first started training as a coach, I had a client who would constantly change their goals. And my supervisor wasn't a supervisor in the way we would know them today, because it was much earlier in the profession. But my mentor, let's say, said, well, if they keep changing their goals, they're not committed, drop them as a client. So what happened to that non-judgment? You only don't judge if they're going to be a client, but you're going to judge them in the first place to be a client. It's kind of interesting. So I think the first thing is to really, really accept the idea of non-judgmentalism. Then the next one is witness and witness. And witness was a word, I don't know whether it was used first by Michael White, but Michael White in narrative therapy talked about witness. And I loved that word when he said it. Now, it might have come from another modality. I really don't know. But he talked about the act of being with, and then witnessing through that being with. And he talked about a young lad who, I don't remember the story much anymore, but this young lad kind of experienced something really profound in the session without the therapist, because Michael was a narrative therapist, without him doing pretty much anything. But what was important to this young lad was being seen to have had these realizations, rather than to be catalyzed into having them. So I think there's really something important about being with, and with that witness leading to being a witness to the understanding. And then noticing the unnoticed. I think this is really critical. When I think about my own journey, I think there's a lot that if somebody said to me, what are your patterns, Nick? I could probably have told you them, but I don't really think I noticed them in a way that was like, that's what I need to lean into. So I think there's something about for us as coaches, how do we notice the unnoticed so that we raise that? And that's about naming, it's about the phenomenological moment, it's about experiencing what's happening there and then. It's all these sorts of things, but it's just like, it's about sharing what you're perceiving without judging it or interpreting it. These sorts of things is noticing the unnoticed. Then holding an emergent space rather than a linear space. How do we start to treat coaching as a space where the learning is happening all the time and it can change from moment to moment? So it might be think you're figuring out this part of your life and you suddenly realize, oh my God, that's actually about this. And instead of going, well, okay, well, how does that relate to this? We stay with it. Okay, what does that mean to you as we start to notice that? So holding an emergent space and then exploring the meaning of contradiction. How does that behavior that you have that contradicts with this one, what does it mean to you? Not changing it, exploring the meaning of the contradiction. What does it mean to their life? What does it mean in terms of what they might be thinking, feeling, believing, sensing? All these sorts of things can come from the contradiction. And then holding paradox and not trying to resolve paradox. Years ago, I thought I was very existential. And in some ways I was, because I thought about existential stuff. But my good friend Yannick said to me, he didn't say it to me about myself, but he said it in passing about existentialism was living with the unresolvable paradoxes of life. And I was like, oh yeah, all this time I've been trying to resolve the paradoxes. All this time I thought I was being existential in the sense I was dealing with these, I think in existential terms about life, but I was figuring out as a young, trusting entrepreneur how I would resolve them. Whereas actually I think as coaches, we can hold the paradox, allow that client to have both and. Or who was it? Was it complementarity? Was it Bohm or Bohr? Niels Bohr? I think it was Niels Bohr who talks about complementarity, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs in your mind at the same time. We might describe that as cognitive dissonance, which is something that we are meant to resolve. But what if it's not cognitive dissonance? What if it's a paradox? I can live with these two different things, and they both serve me at different times. It's almost like our life is like a parallel universe. We have different versions of ourselves in different moments, and they have different belief systems that can both inhabit the same body and be useful in different times. Next is honor the pace and process. I remember when I started teaching coaching years ago, not teaching coaching, introducing coaching to people who weren't coaches. Like I'm talking early 2000s, I used to work for another coaching company at first, and we used to do these introduction sessions. And one of the qualities that we'll often come up with is what skills and qualities do you need to be a coach? And one of them was always patience. You need to be patient. Do you? If you're patient, what does that imply? It implies that you feel they should be getting there sooner than they are. And that your patience is a skill you've developed or a quality you've developed in order to put up with these blinking slow people who don't get there as fast as you would if you were in their place. Patience is not a quality we need in coaching, really. What we need is belief in self-actualization and curiosity for where they are at any given moment on that journey of change for themselves. Patience is an imposition if you think about it. It's like, I know where you should be and you're not there, so I'm going to be patient. And so some of the worst ones are where coaches give away that they knew what the clients just figured out. They knew it ages ago, and they give them like a knowing wink. Aha, you're there, are you? Oh my God, when that happened to me, when I'm a client and that happens to me, I want to close that coaching session straight away. It's so annoying when a coach does that. Like, I was there before you, but I'm glad you reached where I've got to. It's so annoying. So it's such a lack of respect for what's really, like, we don't know what that epiphany was. We might have some approximation to it. We might have some idea that it's in the same ballpark, but it isn't a visceral experience. And yet we give them, we don't. Some coaches give this kind of knowing wink. Like, glad you got there. It's incredible when I see that. We need to really, really, truly honor the pace and process that a client goes through in order to become who they already are. And then integrate the shadow. And of course, I'm not particularly talking about Jungian concepts of the shadow here. I'm just talking about what is not often brought up. This is what I meant in my very first lecture last year, where I talked about the disavowed forces of coaching. We're not stupid human beings. If we're being coached and we haven't done something we said we're going to do, we have a pretty good idea the coach might have some feeling about that. And even if the coach doesn't, we think they might. So things like shame and what are the sort of things? Shame and embarrassment or fear or even attraction. These are sort of shadow elements of coaching. And I think we can talk about them. We're two adults who have a compassionate space where we both recognize that being human is complex and comes with emotions. And we both recognize that we're in a currently collaborative space where we're working together. And we're both coming from a place, or at least the coach should be coming from a place of unknowing, where they're not imposing their belief structure on the client. Why not talk about some of these shadow areas? How does it feel to talk about that thing that you do? How does it feel? And how do you think I'm feeling about it? Because they might be thinking, well, I can't talk to my coach about that because that's not something I should feel. What if we talk about that? What if we talk about the shame they might be feeling about it? That they changed their mind all the time, or they didn't do what they said they were going to do. Why don't we talk about that? Why don't we have it in the open? How do you think I'm feeling about the fact you didn't do that? Well, I'm a bit embarrassed. What's that embarrassment about? It's better than letting that possible embarrassment or that possible judgment hover unspoken. And then cultivate compassionate self-observation. If we help the client really step into self-observation with a sort of, I'd almost call it a humor. I don't know how you feel about life, but to me, I find it very funny. I often laugh inappropriately at things that people say. I was talking to one of my faculty members recently, and she was telling me what a stressful time it was when we had to change our course very, very, very quickly back in 2021 because the ICF completely changed their accreditation structure. We had 2 months to recreate our course, 2 months to recreate our course and launch it. And we did a pretty good job, but she was the first person to deliver the course. And she said to me, "That's really stressful, Nick." And I couldn't help laughing because to me, looking back 3 years ago, it's kind of funny what we go through and the things we put importance to. I didn't laugh at her. I was laughing at the absurdity of the things we give importance to. And so when I think about compassionate self-observation, it's also about humor. Isn't it funny the way we do the things we do? If we can treat this with a level of humor, it can actually be a lot more, forgiving is the wrong word, but forgiving for the self. And then finally, really helping the client connect acceptance with change. I think, one of our 12 principles is the pragmatic principle. And I think something in coaching is that we always try to figure out what's coming out of this. And I went to therapy a couple of times, always in connection with relationships. And my tendency to end relationships. And what I noticed when I was in therapy was, and by the way, I'm not saying all therapy is like this at all, but it was my experience of it, was that there was never a moment where the therapist said, what are you taking from this? What's been catalyzed for you in some way? Or what's going to change for you as a result of this? Or what awareness have you had and how might that impact you? It wasn't. We'd talk and talk and talk. And at 50 minutes, this is absolutely how it was. At 50 minutes, you say, okay, time's up. Like almost mid-sentence. I'll be, oh, okay, see you next week. And I think in coaching, one of the things I love about coaching is the way we connect insights to real sort of consciousness. That doesn't have to be, I'm going to do this. It doesn't mean I'm going to have a tick list of things to do, but we bring that learning to consciousness rather than being only unconscious or hoped for, let's say. So I think some of those are the kind of the ways we can bring this pragmatically into coaching. And I just want to end with a few reflective questions that you can ask yourselves after this call or whenever you want to. So the first one is, at what point do I bring the focus to change versus deepening awareness? Do you find yourself, seeking to get the client to a change point straight away, soon? Do you kind of rush towards what's the change that needs to happen? Or do you find that you are sitting with the client, sitting with the unknown, and deepening the awareness of what's going on? Like, how does it feel to experience that right now? What's that behavior look like in practice? When you do that, what happens around you? Who's the impact? How does it impact you? When we start to really think about what is happening, what is the case versus what do you want to happen, then we stay with deepening awareness as opposed to change. Now, that's not to say that the change questions aren't valid. They absolutely are. The question for me as a reflective practitioner is, at what point do I find myself moving towards that change point versus the deepening awareness? And the next one is, how comfortable am I to stay with uncertainty as a coach? I mean, one thing is how comfortable is the client, but you can't really impact that directly. You can only impact that through the dialogue. But one thing you can look at is, how comfortable are you staying in uncertainty? How much do you think you need to be making an impact with the client straight away? Like, oh my God, this person's paying me this much money for an hour and I haven't got 5 action steps they can take already. Somebody asked me recently, very recently, literally in the last week or so, Nick, when have you had really transformative coaching? And I said, most coaching I've had has been useful, but it's been incremental. It's helped me take action in a certain path. And it's been great because, at that point, that's what I needed. But I had one very transformative moment where a student of mine, ex-student, she'd qualified, but she was kind of putting herself through an experiment where she decided to coach 100 people that scared her in the sense of there was something in that potential coaching relationship that would be like, woof. And because I was the founder of a coaching school, I was like, my God, am I going to coach him? But she reached out to me and said, hey, I'm trying to coach 100 people for one session each. Would you be willing to be coached by me? And I said, yeah, I would. Could be interesting. And she asked a very non-coachy question. This was at the point where I said to my wife in the January of 2023 that I felt like I wanted to start a new life and go traveling and separate from her and all this kind of thing. But I then proceeded to live with her for another year because she was Chinese and I was helping with her visa and stuff. But it was a hard year because, like, you're living with somebody you love, but you're making a decision to leave them and you're racked by self-doubt. I was racked by self-doubt and like, what are you doing this for, Nick? Anyway, I thought, right, if you're going to coach me, blink and I'll coach me on something big. So I brought that to the session. And at one point she said to me, Nick, I have a feeling you're a people pleaser. Would you say you're a people pleaser? And I thought to myself, well, number one, it's a terrible coaching question because you've led. But it was a fantastic coaching question. It was what I needed to hear at that moment. So whilst the ICF might have said, no, you're not getting away with that, I was like, what a fantastic question. Because number one, we were in a collaborative space together. So I knew that her heart was in the right place. Number two, she was acting phenomenologically. That's to say, she was responding to what she was seeing and making sense of for her. She wasn't imposing it. She was saying, this is what has come up for me. How does that land when I share it with you? She was also acting from a place of unknowing, and that she wasn't saying you are people pleasing. which wouldn't have landed well with me. She said, I feel like you are. So she owned it. And then she gave me the ability to own it or not by saying, do you think you are? Or whatever the exact question is. This was years ago, and I can't remember why I'm saying this story now, how it relates to comfortable staying with uncertainty. But anyway, point being that that for me was a genuine transformation point, because it helped me see that, yes, I am a people pleaser, in the sense that I genuinely love to make people happy, and sometimes at my own expense, very often at my own expense. And recognizing that meant I could now make a choice. How do I deal with that? Do I want to still be a people pleaser? I don't think I can shake that. But do I want to find ways to live with it in a new way? I think it's probably a good idea. Got no idea how that story came up with relation to that bullet point. I apologize. But hopefully it made sense when I said it. But yeah, how comfortable are you staying with uncertainty? Because I think transformative questions create uncertainty, both for the coach and for the client. And then going back to my slide earlier, do you unintentionally reinforce shoulds in your coaching? Such as, you shouldn't have shoulds. Such as, you should strive for the best life. Such as, you'll know what's right for you. Such as, everything happens for a reason. Such as, and so on and so on and so on. These things that they sort of exist in the coaching world at a paradigmatic level. It's like coaching has emerged from the soil of a certain paradigm that has these beliefs built in. They're like the germs of the soil, and they grow up through the roots of what we do. But I think we should avoid these shoulds. What assumptions do I hold about what progress should look like as a coach? Do I find myself thinking that progress is about achieving the goal they said they set, even though the goal might not actually be what they really want? I remember coaching somebody who said they wanted a business, and it was really, really clear that they weren't taking any action towards the business. And what it actually transpired was that the business was a kind of a cover for what they really wanted, which was to have a career in the city, but they'd made a certain pact with the partner and so on and so on. And so the goal that I could have forced them to keep moving towards, if had I kept saying, let's get back to your goal, let's get back to your goal, let's get back to your goal, would have missed the fact that there was a deeper issue in that person's life. So if I judge myself according to making progress against the initial goal, I'm going to be missing all that stuff. And, one of the things I often think about is how much do we keep our blinkers on as coaches? If I'm like this as a coach, eyes on the goal, eyes on the prize. If I've got eyes on the prize, I'm going to miss all the stuff that's out here. And so is the client. And then how do I respond when the client seems stuck? Sometimes when a client seems stuck, we feel like there's a problem. Oh my goodness, my client is stuck. I must be asking the wrong questions. Well, what would it be like to stay with the stuckness? What is it like to experience the stuckness? What might exist in that stuckness as meaning? Maybe that stuckness is representative of something, like they don't really want what they say they want, or that a part of them is conflicting with another part of them. Whatever it might be, how do you stay with that stuckness rather than thinking you're asking the wrong questions? And then, am I more focused on movement, i.e. change, than on the client's experience of themselves? I can definitely resonate with that as a coach. For a long time in my life, my focus was on, I remember I tell the story in my 12 Principles book, I think, or was it in my second one? But there was this client I worked with who was a very successful banker. In fact, I was still, like, my coaching school was still relatively new. I wasn't earning much money because it was a new company and I was paying my staff more than myself. And this banker came along and he was earning tons. And I was like, my God, this guy's got so much money. I couldn't believe it. Was crazy. I was like, how does somebody earn that much? But he wanted to do something completely different. He wanted to be spiritual. But no matter how much we coached on this, nothing seemed to change. And I really, really sort of like judged myself on that. Like, why did I not create the movement that he was after? And then years later, he rang me and he told me, Nick, that coaching really shifted stuff for me, but it took longer than I expected. It took longer than you expected, actually, he said. It took longer than I expected. Because he then ended up building a retreat in Nepal and running retreats. That was his own business in Nepal, running retreats, from banker to running these retreats and having his own kind of retreat center at the base of a mountain. Incredible. But it took a lot longer than I had in my mind, because I was focused on making movement happen then rather than really raising self-awareness. And then finally, how can I help a client reflect on their new awareness and the meaning this may have? In other words, how do I connect awareness to the potential for difference and change? So I want to wrap up with a final statement, and then I'm going to sort of open up to any reflections, questions before I close off. Yes, I was just finishing really by saying that, despite the challenges of my current life, I absolutely know it's the right choice, but it's taken 55 years to get there. So I really, I guess my point is that once you start to realize who you are, you can start to inhabit the life you really want. And that's where I'd like to end. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure. I didn't realize I've gone on for 1 hour and 20 minutes. Apologies for that. But if anyone's got any final points, questions, etc., I'm happy to take them before we close off. Thank you.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat from Annalise. Do you see a difference in contradiction, paradox, and cognitive dissonance?
Yes. I haven't thought it through enough to be able to give a really cogent answer, but yes, I do. I think contradictions are more pragmatic in a sense. Paradox, I think, and they can be resolved. I think contradictions can be resolved. I think paradoxes, in a sense, can't be resolved. That's what makes them a paradox, in a sense. Cognitive dissonance, I would say it's different, but I honestly I haven't had time to think that through. I'm not even going to attempt to answer it, is my answer. I suspect, who asked the question?
That was from Annalise.
Annalise, yeah. Thank you, Annalise, for the question. I honestly can't answer it without, maybe I'll even do an article on this now, because that's actually a really, really interesting question. I do feel that contradictions can be resolved, paradoxes can't. Where cognitive dissonance sits with that is another issue, I think.
Okay, fab. And then there was another question from Ali. I'd love to try AI coaching to experience for myself what is lacking versus coaching with a human. Have you found a good one, Nick Bolton?
No, I have not found a good one. And that's not because I've tried and tried and tried. I only tried like a couple of times. What I found, Ali, was that the two attempts I gave it went straight to pragmatism. In other words, what could you do differently? And I was like, whoa, hold on, slow your jets, or what do they cool your jets? I'm not ready for that yet. I need to kind of understand what's going on for me first. But it's almost like it didn't recognize. I'm not saying it won't, and I'm sure it will keep evolving. It didn't seem to recognize that the first step was for me to figure out what was going on for me emotionally before I try to change anything. So yeah, I mean, I know that Rebecca Ruchman is a big name in this field of AI coaching. I'm sure that she's got stuff that does work, but my experience was very narrow and didn't work for me. Well, unless there is a question, I would say thank you so much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure. My next talk is in April. It's on the phenomenology of time in transformative coaching, looking at how we each relate individually to time, past, present, and future, and how that relationship governs to some degree how we live our lives. So I find myself very future oriented, and I'm always looking forward to the next thing without truly enjoying what I'm currently doing. That's kind of my time narrative. But and again, going back to accepting who I am, I've started to be okay with that. It kind of gives me joy to think about what's next, rather than going, you must be more present, Nick. Go and read, who was the guy that wrote The Power of Now? Go and read Eckhart Tolle, Nicholas. You've got to change your way of being. No, I'm kind of good with where I am. But other people live in the present. Some people live in the past. That's coming up. We've also got next month, Nathan Blair talking about the putting the whole back into resourceful, creative, and whole, looking at holistic principle in coaching. So that should be fun. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.